Welcome to a short lesson on factoring using the distributive property. In this particular case, you are factoring a polynomial. What you want to do is find the greatest common factor shared by all the terms in the polynomial and factor that out. So in this example, I am given the binomial 9x squared plus 36x. In order to figure this out, I want to look at these two terms and consider what do they have in common. 9 goes into itself, of course, but 9 also goes into 36. And they both have 1x in common. Even though 9x squared has 2 x's, the 36x has only 1. Therefore, I can only factor out the x once. So the way I like to do this is I like to say, okay, the greatest common factor here is going to be 9, because 9 goes into both of them, and x, because x goes into both of them. Then I divide each of these terms by the greatest common factor to see what's left. So I know that this statement, 9x squared plus 36x, will equal 9x times some binomial. But in order to figure out what goes here, I'm going to take each of these terms. So I'm going to take 9x squared, and I'm going to divide by the GCF of 9x. When I do this, you'll notice that the 9's cancel and one of the x's cancel. And what I'm left with is simply x. So my first term is x. I then take my second term, which is 36x, and I divide it by the greatest common factor of 9x. And in this case, I notice that my x's cancel, and 36 divided by 9 is 4. So I am left with just plus 4. This is as factored as this polynomial can get. In order to double check my work, I could go back and distribute. And sure enough, I would see that 9x times x is 9x squared, and 9x times 4 is 36x. So I can verify that I did this correctly. Sometimes I have a trinomial, so I have more terms to consider. So in my next example, I'm going to factor the trinomial 4r squared plus 8rs plus 28r. So the first thing I need to do is take a look at 4, 8, and 28 and consider what's the largest whole number that goes into both of them. And I believe you'll see that it's 4. 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, and 4 times 7 is 28. So I'm going to factor out a 4. Then I look to see, well, what else do they have in common? R squared, R, and R. So they all have at least one R. So as I begin to factor, I'm going to ask myself, if I took 4r squared and divided by 4r, what would be left? Just r. So that's my first term. If I take 8rs and I divide by 4r, my r's cancel and I would be left with 2s. So that's my second term in my trinomial. And then lastly, I'll take 28r, divide by 4r, my r's cancel, and 28 divided by 4 is 7. So that's my last term. And this would be my final answer for a factorization of this polynomial. Sometimes I'm asked to actually solve an equation, not just factor for the sake of factoring. In order to do that, we use a property called the zero product property, which simply says that if you have two factors, a times b, and they equal 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0, or a and b each equal 0. So I can use this property of the zero product in order to solve an equation. And you have a couple of problems like this on your homework. So I'm going to do number 21 in the book for you. This will be example 3. I have x times x minus 24 is equal to 0. I can think of this as two separate factors. I have an x, and then I have an x minus 21. So in order, or minus 24 rather. So in order for these to be multiplied and equal 0, I'm going to write two new equations. Either x equals 0 or x minus 24 equals 0. This one's already solved. This means x might actually equal 0. For this one, I would solve for x by adding 24 to both sides, and I would find that x equals 24. So my final answer is x equals 0 or x equals 24. If either of these conditions are true, then this statement would equal 0. Sometimes I have one in which I might actually have to do a little factoring myself. So for example, if I were to have a problem such as x squared minus 6x equals 0, first I would factor this binomial. I would factor out an x so that I get x times x minus 6 equals 0. Now it looks a lot like my former problem, and I know that either x equals 0 or x minus 6 equals 0. If x minus 6 equals 0, I would again add 6 to both sides and get x equals 6. So I have two answers, x equals 0 or x equals 6. I hope this will assist you in figuring out your homework problems tonight.
Oops!